The afternoon sun was high in the sky, shining down brightly on the busy movie set. It was a typical day for the cast and crew, filled with the loud noises of construction and the buzzing voices of people rushing to get everything ready. Large metal cranes stood tall against the blue backdrop, holding massive lights that blasted the area with heat. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, and the air was dry and warm. The set was designed to look like a busy city street, but it was just a fake world built on a concrete lot. Keanu stood near the center of all this chaos. He was wearing his costume, which looked like it had been through a lot, just like the character he was playing. To everyone else, he looked calm and ready. He was reading through his lines one last time, his head down, focusing quietly. But if someone had looked very closely, they might have noticed he was not standing as straight as usual. He was leaning just a little bit to one side. For the past few days, Keanu had been feeling a strange pain in his stomach. At first, it was just a dull ache, something he could easily ignore. He had spent his whole life doing action movies, jumping off buildings, and getting into fights for the camera. Pain was something he was used to. He knew how to push it to the back of his mind and get the job done. He thought this was just another bruise or maybe a pulled muscle from a stunt he had done the week before. He didn't complain. He never liked to complain. He knew that hundreds of people were working hard on this movie, and he didn't want to be the reason things slowed down. The director, a man with a loud voice and a lot of energy, called everyone to their places. "Okay, everyone, quiet on the set," he shouted. "We are rolling in 3, 2, 1, action." The scene started. Keanu began to move, walking across the pavement. The camera followed him closely. He was supposed to look focused and intense, and he did a great job of hiding how he really felt. But with every step he took, a sharp pain shot through his side. It felt like a knife was twisting inside him. He gritted his teeth, keeping his face blank so the camera wouldn't catch his discomfort. He reached a spot where he had to stop and lean against a fake brick wall. This was actually perfect for him because he really needed the support. As he leaned there, waiting for his co-star to walk over and deliver his lines, a cold sweat broke out across Keanu's forehead. The heat from the lights suddenly felt overwhelming. The air around him seemed to get thicker and harder to breathe. He took a slow, shallow breath, trying to calm his body down. His co-star, a younger actor who looked up to Keanu, walked up and started speaking his lines. The young man was full of energy, acting with passion. Keanu looked him in the eyes, listening intently, but the words sounded like they were coming from underwater. The ringing in his ears was getting louder. He knew he had to say his next line. He pushed himself off the wall and stood up straight. That was a mistake. A massive wave of pain crashed over him, so strong that it nearly took his breath away. His vision went blurry for a second, turning the bright set into a mess of gray shapes. He stumbled slightly, catching himself just before he fell. He managed to say his line, his voice sounding a bit weaker than usual, but the director seemed to like it. Maybe he thought Keanu was just acting tired and beaten down. "Cut!" the director yelled. "That was great. Let's try it one more time, just a little faster this time." Keanu nodded slowly. He didn't trust his voice to speak. He wiped a hand over his face, trying to wipe away the sweat and the dizziness. He looked around for a bottle of water and saw a crew member holding one out to him. He took it with a shaky hand and took a small sip. The cool water felt good going down, but as soon as it hit his stomach, the pain flared up again, worse than before. He had to clench his fist to stop from groaning out loud. People on the set were moving around, adjusting the lights and moving props for the next take. No one really noticed that Keanu was struggling. They all saw him as a superhero, someone who never got hurt. He was the guy who did his own stunts, who rode motorcycles fast, and who always had a smile for the crew. They thought he was just resting, but the pain was not going away. It was getting sharper and more defined. It wasn't just a stomach ache anymore. It felt like something serious was wrong deep inside his body. He looked down at his side and pressed his hand against it, hoping to apply some pressure to make it stop. It didn't help. He felt hot and then cold all at once. The makeup artist came up to him to wipe some shine off his face. She smiled at him, chatting about how hot it was today. Keanu tried to smile back, but he knew it looked more like a grimace. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice dropping a little as she noticed how pale his skin looked under the powder. "Yeah, I'm good," Keanu whispered. "Just a little tired." It's the heat. She nodded and went back to her station. She didn't want to bother him. Everyone respected his space. The director called for everyone to get back into position. All right, let's go again. Same energy. Action. Keanu took a deep breath. He told himself he could do this. He just had to get through this one scene and then they would break for lunch. He could rest then. He took a step forward, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if he were standing on a boat that was rocking back and forth. He started his lines. He was walking, talking, and moving his arms, but he felt detached from his body, like he was watching himself from a distance. The pain was now the only thing he could think about. It was screaming at him, demanding that he stop. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, his voice just stopped. The set went silent. The camera kept rolling, but Keanu didn't say his next line. He stood frozen for a second, his eyes wide. He looked confused. He tried to take a step toward his co-star, but his knees gave out. He didn't fall to the hard ground. A stuntman who was standing nearby watching the scene saw him falter. He lunged forward and caught Keanu before he could hit the concrete. Whoa. Keanu, the stuntman shouted, holding him up. The director yelled, "Cut!" But this time his voice was full of panic, not authority. What happened? Is he okay? The silence on the set was broken by the sound of people rushing over. Keanu was trying to stand up, trying to say he was fine, but he couldn't find the strength. His head was spinning, and the pain in his side was so bad he felt like he might pass out. He looked at the faces crowding around him, the worried crew members, the director, the young actor he had been speaking with. Their faces were blurred, but he could feel their concern. I need a minute," Keanu tried to say, but his voice was barely a whisper. He was sweating heavily now, his shirt sticking to his back. The stuntman gently lowered him to the ground, sitting him up against the fake wall. Someone ran to get a medic. Someone else brought a chair. The air was tense. The casual vibe of the movie set had vanished instantly. Keanu leaned his head back against the fake bricks and closed his eyes. He took a slow, painful breath. He knew he couldn't hide this anymore. He wasn't just tired, he was in trouble. The thought of disappointing everyone, of stopping the production, crossed his mind. But it was quickly washed away by a much stronger feeling, a realization that whatever was happening inside him was bigger than the movie. The medic arrived, pushing through the circle of people. He knelt down beside Keanu and started asking questions, checking his pulse, looking at his eyes. Keanu tried to answer, but he felt himself slipping away, the sounds of the set fading into the background. The last thing he saw before they started to lift him up was the blue sky above the studio roof, and the bright lights that now seemed so far away. He was no longer the action hero on the screen. He was just a man in pain, surrounded by people who cared about him, waiting for help to arrive. The sudden silence on the movie set was heavy. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful moment. It was the shocked silence of people seeing a strong man fall. Keanu was on the ground, leaning against the fake wall, his face pale and sweaty. The medic who had been kneeling beside him was speaking into a radio, calling for an ambulance with a calm but urgent voice. Around them, the crew stood frozen. No one was moving. The cameras that usually captured every move were now forgotten, pointing uselessly at the empty space where Keanu had been standing just moments before. Keanu tried to look around, but his vision was swimming. He could see blurry shapes of people he worked with every day. He saw the worry in their eyes. He wanted to stand up and tell them it was okay, that he just needed a moment, but his body wouldn't listen. A sharp, throbbing pain in his side was taking over all his senses. It felt like a tight fist was squeezing his insides, twisting harder with every breath he took. Within minutes, the distant sound of a siren began to wail. It started soft and grew louder, cutting through the usual noise of the city. The red and blue lights of the ambulance flashed against the studio walls, reflecting off the windows of the fake buildings. When the vehicle finally came to a stop near the set, the back doors swung open, and two paramedics jumped out with a gurney. They moved with the kind of practiced speed that comes from doing this every day. They didn't care about the movie star, they only cared about the patient. As they pushed through the crowd to reach Keanu, the lead paramedic knelt down. "Hey there," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're going to get you to the hospital. Just try to relax and let us do the work." Keanu nodded slightly. He felt a pair of strong hands lifting him, and suddenly he was off the ground. They placed him gently onto the gurney. The movement made the pain spike, and he let out a low groan that he couldn't hold back. The paramedics immediately strapped him in, placing a cervical collar around his neck to keep his spine safe, just as a precaution. They covered him with a clean, white sheet. In just a few seconds, the tough action hero was transformed into a vulnerable patient. The group moved quickly toward the ambulance. The crowd of actors and crew members parted like water, watching silently. The young actor Keanu had been speaking with looked terrified, his hands clutching his own script nervously. The director stood with his hands on his hips, looking helpless. It was a stark reminder that no matter how much money was spent on a film, human health was the only thing that really mattered. Once inside the ambulance, the doors closed, shutting out the noise of the set. It was instantly quieter, though the siren began to wail again as the driver put the vehicle in gear. The paramedic who stayed in the back with Keanu began to check his vital signs. He attached a small clip to Keanu's finger to measure his oxygen levels and wrapped a blood pressure cuff around his arm. The machine beeped rhythmically, a sound that was both comforting and scary. "Hang in there," the paramedic said, checking the monitors. "Your blood pressure is a bit low, but we're going to fix that up." The ride was bumpy. Every time the ambulance turned a corner, Keanu felt a wave of nausea. He stared up at the metal ceiling of the vehicle, trying to focus on the seams to keep his mind off the pain. He felt lonely in that small space, even though the paramedic was right there. It was strange to think that just an hour ago, he was pretending to be someone else, and now he was fighting a very real battle. The fake world of the movie set felt miles away. Outside, the city was rushing by. The ambulance weaved through traffic, other cars pulling over to let it pass. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared as the big vehicle sped past, unaware that the person inside was a famous actor. To the world outside, it was just another siren in the city. But inside, a life was hanging in the balance. Finally, the vehicle slowed down and made a sharp turn. The tires crunched on the pavement as they pulled into the emergency bay. The driver announced over the intercom that they had arrived. The back doors opened, and the bright sunlight hit Keanu's face, making him squint. He was wheeled quickly toward the entrance of the hospital. There were no heavy wooden barriers to slow them down, only the smooth, automatic sliding glass doors that parted effortlessly as they approached. The cool, air-conditioned air rushed out to meet them, a sharp contrast to the hot sun outside. The inside of the emergency room was a different world. It was bright, clean, and smelled strongly of antiseptic and cleaning products. Nurses and doctors in scrubs of blue and green moved with purpose. The gurney was wheeled into a large, open area divided by curtains. A team of medical staff was waiting, having received a report from the paramedics while they were en route. Male, mid-50s, severe abdominal pain, low blood pressure. The paramedic reported quickly as they transferred Keanu from the ambulance gurney to the hospital bed. The doctors took over immediately. A woman with kind eyes and a stethoscope around her neck leaned over Keanu. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm Dr. Evans." "We're going to take good care of you." Keanu blinked, looking up at her. He could see the concentration on her face. "It hurts," he managed to whisper. "I know," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to figure out why. Just try to stay still for us." Nurses were busy attaching wires to his chest to monitor his heart and inserting an IV line into his arm to deliver fluids. The sharp prick of the needle was nothing compared to the pain in his stomach. He felt the cold fluid entering his vein, which actually felt a little soothing. While the medical team worked around him, a hospital staff member pulled the production manager, who had followed the ambulance in his own car, aside to handle the paperwork. The atmosphere was chaotic but controlled. There was no screaming or panic, just the professional hum of people doing their jobs to save a life. Meanwhile, Keanu lay on the narrow bed, staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights. He felt small and scared. He was used to being in control, to knowing his lines and his moves, but here, he had to trust strangers with his life. He could hear the beeping of machines, the rolling of wheels on the linoleum floor, and the murmurs of the doctors discussing his symptoms. He thought about the people on the set. He hoped they weren't too worried. He thought about his sister and his close friends, wondering who would call them. He hated the idea of them getting a phone call with bad news. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find a quiet place in his mind, away from the pain and the bright lights. The doctor ordered a series of tests immediately. They needed blood work and a CT scan to see what was happening inside his body. Two orderlies came to move him. They unlocked the wheels of the bed and began to push him down the long, white hallway. Keanu opened his eyes and watched the ceiling tiles pass by one. He passed other patients in the hallway, some sitting in wheelchairs, others lying on beds just like him. For a moment, he felt a strange connection to them. They were all just humans dealing with their own struggles. The CT scan room was dark and cold. The machine was a large, white circle with a narrow bed sliding through the middle. They transferred him carefully onto the scanner bed. "We need you to hold very still," a technician said softly. "This won't take long." Keanu gripped the rails on the side of the bed. The pain made it hard to lie flat, but he did his best not to move. The machine began to hum, and the bed slid him into the giant tube. He took deep breaths, staring at the smooth, white surface just inches from his face. He felt isolated, trapped in the machine, but he knew this was the only way to find out what was wrong. When the scan was finished, they wheeled him back to the emergency room bay. The doctor was waiting, looking at a computer screen. Her expression was serious, unreadable. She walked over to his bedside. "We have the initial images back," she said, her voice calm but low. "We need to talk about what we see." The air in the small curtain area felt heavy. Keanu looked at her, fear rising in his chest. The pain was still there, throbbing relentlessly, but now it was mixed with a deep sense of dread. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, bracing himself for whatever she was about to say. The quiet moments of waiting on the set were gone, replaced by the loud, beeping reality of the hospital. The real fight was just beginning. The sterile environment of the hospital waiting area felt miles away from the glitz and noise of a movie premiere. The room was painted in soft, calming colors, but there was no calm to be found for the small group of people huddled in the plastic chairs. This was the private waiting lounge, reserved for families going through critical moments. The air here smelled of coffee and antiseptic, a strange combination that made the stomach turn. A woman, who had been his personal assistant for many years, sat with her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She was staring at a pattern in the carpet, trying to distract her mind, but the fear kept creeping back in. She thought about all the times she had seen him sign autographs for hours, even when he was tired or hungry. She thought about how he always remembered the names of the crew members, from the lighting technicians to the people who served lunch. He didn't act like a star. He acted like a regular guy who just happened to be famous. Sitting next to her was an old friend, a man who had known him long before the big action movies. He was pacing back and forth across the small room, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Every few minutes, he would stop and look at the white double doors that led to the treatment rooms, willing them to open. He felt helpless. There were no bad guys to fight here, no script to follow to make sure everything turned out all right in the end. "He's tough," the friend said, suddenly breaking the silence. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't drunk water in hours. "He's the toughest person I know. If anyone can pull through this, it's him." The assistant looked up, her eyes red. "I know," she said softly, "but everyone has a limit, even him." They fell back into silence, the weight of those words hanging in the air. They both knew his history. They knew about the tragedies he had faced in his private life, losses that would have broken a lesser person. He had carried those griefs quietly, never letting them stop him from being kind to others. The thought of him in pain, alone in a hospital room, was almost too much to bear. It felt unfair that life was throwing another punch at someone who had already taken so many hits. Outside the building, the scene was different but equally somber. The sun was still shining, casting a golden glow over the city, but the mood near the emergency entrance was tense. News trucks had parked along the street, their satellites pointing up at the sky. Reporters stood in front of cameras, speaking in hushed tones, updating the public on the star's condition. But it wasn't just the media. A crowd of fans had gathered behind the temporary metal barriers set up by security. There were perhaps 50 people at first, but the number kept growing. They weren't shouting or screaming like they would at a movie premiere. There was no cheering. Instead, they stood in clusters, talking quietly, holding flowers and handmade signs. It looked more like a vigil than a celebrity sighting. One young man held a sign that simply read, "Get well soon, John Wick." He had driven an hour just to be there. When asked why by a passerby, he shrugged. "He's a good dude," the young man said. "My mom met him once at a coffee shop. He paid for her coffee because she forgot her wallet. He didn't want anyone to know. I just want him to be okay." Stories like that were circulating through the crowd. People shared memories of how he had given up his salary on a movie so the production could afford better special effects, or how he had bought Harley-Davidson motorcycles for the entire stunt team on The Matrix. These weren't just rumors, they were things people had witnessed. The world knew him as an action hero, but the people knew him as a human being with a heart of gold. That was why the anxiety was so palpable. It wasn't just about losing an actor, it felt like losing a friend. Inside the hospital, the waiting room felt smaller with every passing minute. A nurse came in to check on them, offering water or blankets, but she had no update on the patient. The minutes dragged into an hour. The clock on the wall seemed to be moving slower than usual. The friend stopped pacing and sat down, putting his head in his hands. He thought about the text message he had received, the one that said Keanu had collapsed. He kept seeing the image of his friend lying on a gurney, pale and unconscious. "You think he knows we're here?" the assistant asked quietly. The friend looked up. "I hope so. I hope he knows he's not alone." It was strange how a person could be surrounded by millions of fans, yet in a moment of crisis, only a handful of people were allowed to be close. The glass doors to the lounge remained closed. Through the small window, they could see the hallway of the busy hospital. Doctors and nurses walked by with clipboards, wheeling carts of medicine, going about their jobs. To them, this was just another Tuesday. But to the people in the room and to the fans waiting outside, it felt like the world had stopped turning. Suddenly, the door to the hallway opened. Everyone in the room stood up instantly. A doctor walked in. He was wearing blue scrubs and a white coat, and he looked tired. He held a clipboard in one hand and adjusted his glasses with the other. He didn't smile, but he didn't look devastated either. He looked focused. The assistant stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is he okay?" The doctor looked at them both, taking a moment to choose his words carefully. He knew who this man was to the world, but in this room, he was just a patient. "He is stable," the doctor said, letting out a breath. "We have managed his pain, and he is resting comfortably. However, the test results have come back, and—" "The situation is complicated." The friend moved closer. "What do you mean, complicated? What did you find?" The doctor looked down at his papers, then back up at their worried faces. "We initially suspected a routine injury, perhaps a rupture or a tear from a stunt. But what we discovered on the scans is not what we expected. It is something much rarer, and frankly, it is shocking that he was able to function as long as he did with this condition." He paused, looking from the assistant to the friend. The air in the room seemed to stand still. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, but inside there was total silence. "You should come sit down," the doctor said gently, gesturing to the chairs. "What I have to tell you about his internal injuries. It's going to be hard to hear." The color drained from the assistant's face. She grabbed the friend's arm for support. They had braced themselves for bad news, but the doctor's tone suggested that this wasn't just about a broken bone or a bad fall. It was something else, something hidden that had been lurking beneath the surface for a long time. The doctor waited for them to sit, preparing to reveal the secret that the medical team had uncovered. The waiting was over, but the real shock was just beginning. The doctor pulled a chair closer to the small table where the assistant and the friend were sitting. He placed the clipboard down gently, as if the papers on it were made of glass. The room felt incredibly quiet, the only sound being the hum of the air conditioner near the ceiling. The doctor took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a second, looking tired but serious. "I need you to understand what we are seeing here," the doctor began, his voice low and steady. "When the paramedics brought him in, we assumed it was a sudden trauma. Maybe a blow to the stomach during a stunt that went wrong, but the scans tell a very different story." He tapped one of the images on the paper. It was a black and white X-ray look at the internal organs. "This right here, this dark shadow is his spleen. It is not just bruised, it has ruptured. It has been bleeding internally for some time. This is a critical, life-threatening injury. If he hadn't come in when he did, the blood loss would have been fatal within hours. The assistant put a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening. But he was fine yesterday. He was working. That is the part that is difficult to explain, the doctor continued, looking at them with a mix of confusion and professional awe. A rupture like this usually happens instantly, from a severe impact, but looking at the surrounding tissue and the state of his other organs, it seems this was a ticking time bomb. He slid the paper aside and pointed to a digital tablet on the table, swiping through a series of images that looked like a map of a war zone rather than a human body. What has left us truly stunned, the doctor said, pausing to make sure they were listening, is the condition of the rest of his abdomen and chest. Look at these white lines and cloudy spots. That is scar tissue, and not just a little bit. There are layers of it. The friend leaned in, squinting at the screen. What does that mean? It means your friend has been living with injuries that should have put him in a hospital years ago, the doctor said. We see signs of multiple fractured ribs that healed on their own, without ever being set. We see compressed discs in his lower back that have been grinding together for decades. We see old tears in his muscles that have calcified. It is a history of pain written all over his insides. He looked up at the friend. He has broken bones, torn ligaments, and damaged joints, and then just kept going. Most people would be incapacitated by one of these injuries. He has been accumulating them, hiding them, and pushing his body past its limit for years. The room felt heavy as the weight of this revelation sank in. The assistant let out a quiet sob. He never complains, he never says no to a stunt, he just does it. The doctor nodded solemnly. And that is likely what caused this rupture. We believe it was the result of a hard fall he took several weeks ago. He probably bruised his spleen then, but instead of resting and letting it heal, he kept working. He kept filming fight scenes, jumping and falling. The pressure kept building up until today when it finally gave way. He took a deep breath. I have been a surgeon for 20 years. I have treated athletes and soldiers, but I have never seen a body that has withstood this amount of punishment and still functioned at a high level. His pain tolerance must be off the charts. It is honestly a medical miracle that he didn't collapse sooner. The friend sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked devastated. We knew he was tough. We knew he did his own stunts, but we never knew he was destroying himself like this. We never knew he was in so much pain. It appears he protects the people around him from his pain, the doctor said softly. He didn't want to stop the show. He didn't want to let anyone down. So he hurt in silence. The doctor stood up and walked over to the sink, washing his hands as he spoke. The immediate danger is the bleeding. We need to go into surgery immediately to remove the spleen and repair the damage. It is a risky procedure because of the internal bleeding and his overall condition, but he is strong. His heart is healthy and his will, well, you know his will. He turned back to face them. What we found today isn't just a medical emergency. It is a testament to what he puts himself through for his job. The public sees the movies. They see the character on the screen who gets hit and stands back up. They think it is all camera tricks and makeup, but the scan doesn't lie. He takes the hits so the audience gets the real thing. The assistant stood up, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Can we see him? Just for a minute, the doctor said. He is being prepped for the operating room. He is drifting in and out of consciousness, but he will know you are there. They followed the doctor out of the consultation room and down the long, white hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. As they walked, the friend couldn't get the images out of his head. He thought about all the times he had seen Keanu laughing on set, eating lunch with the crew, or riding his motorcycle on weekends. He realized now that behind every smile, there was probably a hidden ache. They stopped at a door where a nurse was adjusting an IV drip. Inside the room, Keanu looked smaller than usual. He was hooked up to monitors that beeped rhythmically. His skin was still pale, but his breathing seemed a bit easier than before. The friend walked over to the bedside and gently touched Keanu's arm. Keanu opened his eyes slowly. They looked glassy and tired, but when he saw his friends, he tried to smile. It was a faint, weak attempt, but it was there. Hey, the friend whispered, his voice cracking. You gave us quite a scare. Keanu moved his head slightly on the pillow. Sorry, he breathed out, his voice barely audible. Didn't mean to worry you. Don't be sorry, the assistant said, stepping up on the other side. She took his hand. It was cool to the touch. The doctor told us everything about the scar tissue, about the old injuries. Why didn't you tell us it was that bad? Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for the strength to answer. When he opened them again, he looked at the monitor beeping beside him. It's the job, he whispered. I just wanted to make it good for everyone. The friend squeezed his arm tighter. It broke his heart to hear that. Keanu had been carrying the weight of every stunt, every fall, every punch all by himself, just to make sure the fans enjoyed the movie. He had sacrificed his own body for the entertainment of strangers, never asking for praise, never asking for help. You're going to be okay, the friend said, forcing a smile. They are going to fix you up, and after this you are going to rest. No more stunts for a while, we mean it. A nurse came into the room, checking her watch. I'm sorry, she said gently. We have to take him up to surgery now. The doctor stepped forward. We will take good care of him. You can wait in the lounge. The surgery will take several hours. As the orderlies began to wheel the bed out of the room, Keanu lifted his hand slightly in a small wave. It was a gesture of reassurance, as if he was the one comforting them. Watching him disappear through the double doors at the end of the hall, the friend and the assistant stood alone in the empty room. The revelation of the scans played over and over in their minds. The world thought they knew Keanu Reeves. They thought they knew the action hero. But today, looking at the hidden map of scars inside him, they realized they didn't know the half of it. They realized just how much of himself he had given away, piece by piece, bruise by bruise, just to bring joy to others. The news of what the doctors found would eventually get out. It would stun the fans and the media. But for these two people standing in the quiet hospital hallway, it wasn't a headline. It was a heartbreaking truth about the man they loved, a man who turned his pain into art and never asked for anything in return. Now it was time for him to stop fighting and let someone else fight for him for a change. The hours passed slowly in the private waiting lounge, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The friend and the assistant sat in the same chairs they had occupied for what seemed like an eternity. The sun, which had been high in the sky when the doctor first showed them the scans, had now begun to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor. The room was quiet, save for the humming of a vending machine in the corner and the occasional footsteps of nurses walking in the hallway. The assistant had stopped crying, but her eyes were red and puffy. She held a cold cup of coffee in her hands, though she hadn't taken a sip in over an hour. The friend was staring at a painting on the wall, trying to lose himself in the abstract shapes, but his mind kept racing back to the images the doctor had shown them. The map of scars. The history of pain. It was heartbreaking to realize that the man they knew as a gentle, smiling soul had been carrying such a heavy burden in silence. Outside the hospital walls, the world was waiting. The crowd that had gathered in the afternoon had not dispersed. In fact, it had grown. As the evening news cycles began, the story of Keanu's hospitalization started to spread. But it wasn't just a headline about a sick celebrity. The details of what the doctors had discovered, that he had been performing with severe, untreated injuries for years, had begun to leak out. People on the street held candles now. The mood had shifted from curiosity to a deep, collective sadness and respect. Fans talked in low voices, sharing stories they had heard over the years. There were stories about him giving up his seat on the subway, or buying a Harley-Davidson for a stunt double who couldn't afford one. They realized that the toughness they saw on screen wasn't an act. It was real, and it came at a personal cost that none of them had truly understood until today. Inside the waiting room, the double doors suddenly swung open. Both the friend and the assistant jumped to their feet instantly. The doctor walked in, still wearing his scrubs, but he looked more relaxed than he had before. He had a surgical cap covering his hair, and he looked tired, but his eyes were bright. He smiled at them. He is out of surgery, he said, and he is doing remarkably well. The assistant let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for days. Thank God, she whispered. The surgery went exactly as we hoped, the doctor explained, leaning against the counter to rest his legs. We successfully removed the ruptured spleen. We repaired the internal bleeding. The damage was extensive, but we got it all under control. He is in the recovery room now, waking up from the anesthesia. The friend ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping in relief. When can we see him? In about 20 minutes, the doctor said. He's going to be groggy and he's going to be sore. He will have a lot of recovering to do, but he is going to be okay. He is strong, incredibly strong. The doctor stayed for a few more minutes, explaining the recovery process and what medications he would be on. Then he left them alone to wait just a little bit longer. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. The fear that had been gripping them was replaced by a warm sense of gratitude. They looked at each other and smiled for the first time in hours. When they were finally allowed to see him, the recovery room was dimly lit and cool. There were several beds separated by curtains, but they knew exactly where to go. Keanu was lying in a bed near the window, hooked up to fewer machines than before, though he still had an IV in his arm and a small tube under his nose to help him breathe. He looked peaceful. The gray pallor was gone from his face, replaced by a healthier, though still pale, color. His chest rose and fell rhythmically. The friend walked up to the side of the bed and gently placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. Keanu stirred slightly. His eyelids fluttered open, blinking slowly as he tried to focus on the faces above him. "Hey," the friend whispered softly. "You made it." Keanu looked at him, his eyes cloudy from the medication. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The assistant quickly grabbed a cup of water with a straw from the bedside table and held it to his lips. He took a small sip and swallowed, wincing slightly at the pain in his abdomen. "Did we finish the scene?" Keanu rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The assistant couldn't help but chuckle, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. "You worried about the movie? You just had major surgery." Keanu managed a tiny, tired smile. "Just checking. You don't need to worry about anything except resting," the friend said firmly. "The doctor says you're going to be fine. But you have to stop breaking yourself for us, okay?" Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, drifting in and out of wakefulness. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "Stop apologizing," the assistant said, squeezing his hand. "People are outside, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They are holding candles. They know about the injuries. They know what you've been carrying. They are just waiting for you to get better." Keanu opened his eyes again, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "For me?" "Yes, for you," the friend said. "Because they love you, not because you're an action star, but because you're a good person." Over the next few days, the story of Keanu's hospitalization took over the news. But it wasn't a sad story. It became a story of inspiration. The headlines didn't focus on the tragedy of an injury, they focused on the revelation of his heart. Fans were stunned to learn that the man who performed death-defying stunts on screen was actually doing them while managing chronic pain and old injuries. They were amazed by his dedication to his craft and his refusal to complain. Social media was flooded with messages of support. People posted clips of his movies, not to celebrate the violence, but to celebrate the movement and the effort behind it. They shared personal stories of his kindness, how he had patiently signed autographs until his hand hurt, how he had treated a lowly crew member with the same respect as a famous director. The stunning discovery wasn't just medical. It was the realization that his toughness was matched only by his humility. A few days later, a final statement was released to the public. It was simple and direct. It said that Keanu was recovering well, resting at home, and that he was overwhelmed by the love and support he had received. It thanked the doctors and the medical staff, and it asked for privacy as he healed. When he finally left the hospital, he didn't sneak out the back door. He walked out the front slowly and carefully with the help of his friend. He was dressed in simple clothes, a jacket over his hospital gown. He looked tired, but he was standing on his own 2 feet. As the automatic glass doors slid open, the crowd that had remained vigil let out a collective cheer. It wasn't a scream of hysteria, it was a roar of love. Keanu stopped for a moment. He looked at the faces pressed against the barriers. He saw the signs that read, "Get well and our hero." He didn't wave like a celebrity. He pressed a hand to his heart, nodded slowly, and gave a small, genuine bow of gratitude. He got into the car, and as they drove away, the friend looked over at him. "How does it feel?" he asked. Keanu leaned his head back against the seat, looking out the window at the city passing by. He was sore, he was tired, and he had a long road of physical therapy ahead of him. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to hide the pain. "It feels good," Keanu said softly, "to know that I'm not just fighting alone." The car disappeared into the traffic, leaving the hospital behind. The sun was shining brightly again. It was just another day in the world, but for the people who knew him, and for the millions who felt they knew him, it was a reminder of something important. We are all fighting battles we don't show the world, and sometimes even the strongest people need a moment to heal, and that perhaps was the most heartfelt story of all.